Hi everybody. Today's lecture is on the Electoral College. Before we get started with the lecture, I want to encourage you to make sure that you're comfortable with a few key terms. Sorry, it took me a second to find the button before we get started. So if you're not already familiar with these four terms, I'd encourage you to look up in the textbook on the pages noted to make sure you have some familiarity with the basic definitions before we move forward. So what we're really talking about today is selecting a president. It turns out that selecting a president was something that the framers had a hard time figuring out how to do. They looked at a variety of options. Alexander Hamilton actually encouraged selection of a king, a president for life. Some thought the legislature should select the president, as was done with governors in many states, and others thought that there should be a popular vote, election of the people, as was done in a number of states, including New York. But they decided not to choose any of those proposals. Rather, the framers decided to create something that they called the Electoral College, something that they invented and something that no one has ever copied. It's a very unusual institution. It's a little hard to understand, so I thought it was worth spending several minutes trying to get a better handle on what it is and where we are with the Electoral College. So it began by giving each state a set number of electors. Those electors are equal to the number of senators each state has, which is 2, and the number of representatives each state has, which is based on population. So states with higher populations have more representatives. Under the original plan, New York had 6 representatives and had a total of 8 electors. Virginia was the biggest state. In terms of population, it had 12 electors because it had 10 representatives, 2 senators. And Delaware was one of a few states that had only 1 representative because of their low population, and they had a total of 3 electors. So electors are based on the number of senators plus House of Representative members that each state has. Each state was allowed to decide how their electors would be chosen. Some states very early on began allowing the people through a popular vote, through a popular election, to pick their electors, but some states had their state legislatures do it, and that was something that was around until the 19th century. In addition, the Electoral College never got together as one group. Rather, these electors, which were actually people chosen to go and decide who the president would be, would meet in each state capital, and they would all go on the same day, and they would vote at roughly the same time. The idea of this Electoral College was, structuring it this way, was they didn't want people to get together in factions, in groups. So they structured it all to meet in this one day. And again, these were individuals they were voting for, either by the legislature or by popular vote. We weren't selecting a presidential candidate. We were selecting someone who would actually go to make that decision for us. And they understood that this wouldn't necessarily produce popular majorities, that there wouldn't be a majority of, somebody would not get the majority of the votes. And so if there was no majority, it went to the House of Representatives, and each state was given 1 vote, and the House of Representatives would decide who the president would be, and the Senate would decide who the vice president would be. So why did the framers support a plan like this? Well, before we talk about, yes, I want to talk a little bit about why they supported this plan. Sorry. First of all, they didn't want to give the legislature too much power. They already had created a very powerful legislative body. We're going to talk more about that soon. In fact, the most powerful legislature in the world. And they didn't want to give it the power to select who the executive would be, the president would be, because they worried that it would give them too much control. They also were worried that the people simply didn't know enough to select a president of the United States. That because literacy was relatively low, because news traveled slow, because getting news was difficult, that it would be best left to prominent people who would know who would be a good president. Thirdly, there was worry about, excuse me, I keep going back and forth. There was worry about factions forming. And so that's why they had all the states meet together. And then finally, there was some fear that the small states would be ignored or left out. And the Electoral College actually weighted selection support for the small states. It turns out a problem was identified very quickly that the framers didn't anticipate, and that was the creation of political parties. With the election of 1796, we see two parties form: the Federalists, the Democratic Republicans, sometimes known as the Jeffersonian Republicans, and all of the Federalist delegates voted for John Adams. Most, not all, but of the Democratic Republican delegates voted for Thomas Jefferson. And so we ended up with a president of one party, a Federalist, a vice president, Thomas Jefferson, of another party. And so the framers Congress initiated what became the 12th Amendment, which combined a ticket of both president and vice president running together. And rather than each elector getting 2 votes, each elector got 1 vote. In addition, there was another early change that states undertook. By 1832, during the Age of Jackson, the Age of Democracy, all states but one selected their electors through a popular vote. Only one state, South Carolina, continued to use state legislatures after that. There were a couple of exceptions, but by the late 19th century, by 1880, no state since has done anything but had the people decide who their electors will be. There have been a series of problems since, though. Some people think these are serious problems, others do not. For example, a number of times, 19 in fact, presidents have been elected without getting a majority of the popular vote. They got the most votes, they got the plurality of the votes, but not the most votes. 4 times, in fact, the winner of the popular vote did not, in fact, win the presidency, and this happened most recently in our last presidential election. Happened a couple of times in the 19th century and also in 2000. And then in one of our presidential elections, there was no Electoral College winner, and that election had to go to the House of Representatives, who chose John Quincy Adams. So, not surprisingly, based on this, there's been a fair amount of criticism of the Electoral College. One we just talked about is that it's undemocratic. First of all, it doesn't count the people's votes directly. We are selecting electors. But also it doesn't necessarily guarantee that the person who gets the most popular votes win. And that's one of the basic principles of democracy. Others would even go farther and say that it doesn't ensure that a majority of the votes are gained by the person who becomes the president of the entire United States. And that's an important democratic principle. So undemocratic is one concern. A second concern is that because of the structure of our elections, which are really 50 separate state elections plus the District of Columbia, that presidential candidates don't focus on a lot of the states. As we'll see in a minute, a number of states are consistently won by the same party's candidate. New York, for example, has been won by the Democrat for a very long time, certainly longer than your lifetimes. California has been the same way. On the other hand, there are a whole host of Midwestern states, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, the Dakotas, and states like Utah and Wyoming that have been won consistently by Republicans for a very long period of time. And so what that means is presidents spend most of their time and their money and their energy focusing on what are called swing states, states where have gone back and forth between the two political parties over the last number of years. And you can see is a list of political swing states in the last several elections, although you may find later that some of these have changed in the 2020 election. In addition, our Electoral College overrepresents low population states. And in fact, Wyoming, a vote is worth 3 times as much as a vote in California because of the Senate and because of relatively low population of states like Wyoming. You note New York is second after California in how our vote is weighted. And then Another concern is that it suppresses voter turnout. So I live in New York. It's going to be a presidential election coming up. I decide I'm not going to bother to vote because it's not going to matter. The Democratic candidate for president is going to win anyway. And that means I don't go vote in the other elections either. And so there's concern that because the Electoral College the outcome is so consistent in many states that it does suppress voter turnout. There also is support for the Electoral College, though. Some people argue that it supports federalism. We are a nation founded on federalism, as we talked about earlier in the semester, a nation founded on states. We have 50 states. We are, most of us as Americans, committed to the idea of having those 50 states, and this is a further way of supporting the distinctness and the importance of states in our system. And in addition, it particularly protects, as the framers also thought, the interests of low population states and makes sure that they have a voice. The concern is that their voice would essentially get drowned out by big states. Yeah. So should we keep it? Should we fix it? Should we replace it? It turns out that's long been the source of debate. There have literally been hundreds of constitutional amendments proposed to either eliminate or change the Electoral College over the last 200 years, but none has been successful. There are some efforts to change the way the Electoral College works, and there are a couple of states that don't give all of their electoral votes to the winner of the most votes in an election. But there are only a couple of states that do that. There has been discussion of simply replacing it and creating a popular vote election for president. So let's look at the recent electoral maps. And part of what you see when we look at these is that there is a lot of consistency. So you notice that New York, for example, which is in the upper right, was consistently blue in 2000 and 2004, blue being Democratic, and also remained blue for 2008 and 2012 and for 2016. And if you go back and forth, you'll see that there are a number of states where this pattern is fairly consistent. The West Coast, this is true of as well. You also note that much of the South has been consistently Republican throughout this period, and the Midwest and Upper Midwest. But you do note that there are some states that switch back and forth. So you note that Florida was Republican early in the last 5 elections. It then became Democratic, and then was Republican again in 2016. That's a great example of a swing state. And so when we think about the Electoral College today, we want to think about it as a series of 50 state elections. In 48 of the states, plus the District of Columbia, the candidate that gets the most electoral votes the candidate who gets the most popular votes gets all of the electoral votes. There are 2 states where this is not true. One of them is Maine, the other Nebraska. And what you see if you look at Maine, which is all the way up the top of the right, is 3 votes went to the Democratic candidate, Hillary Clinton. 1 went to Donald Trump. And what they do is they allow the winner of the statewide race to get 2 votes, the Senate votes, and then they allow the winner of each congressional district, the presidential vote in each congressional district, to get that electoral vote. Nebraska has this system as well, and that's a commonly suggested revision to the Electoral College, and that's actually something that each state could do individually because they get to decide how to apportion electoral votes. So what I'd like you to do now is I have a small assignment for you where I'd like you to look and see what the swing states are for 2020. There have actually been some changes, and I want you to look at what those are and try to understand better what changes are leading to changes in the Electoral College structure. So if you go back out to Blackboard, you'll see that there's an assignment out there for you. So thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Bye.